I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice.
When abolitionist Theodore Parker wrote these words in 1853, he did so with a vision for the nation that few then held. 1 century later, the Brown decision seemed to vindicate his dream. It marked the beginning of the end for de jure segregation, segregation by law. But the practice of segregation, de facto segregation, continued, and challenging this Southern dogma could be lethal. In 1955, a 14-year-old Chicago boy named Emmett Till traveled to visit relatives in Money, Mississippi. A month later, his body returned home in a pine box. For the high crime of whistling at a white woman, Emmett Till had been beaten and shot, and his body dumped in the Tallahatchie River. The legal system had been too slow, the arc too long to save Emmett Till and countless other victims of racial violence. But in the mid-1950s, a new generation of activists mounted a campaign of direct political action and nonviolent protest to exorcise Jim Crow and its violent legacy once and for all. Their fight for freedom and equality became known as the modern civil rights movement. On December 1st, 1955, a department store seamstress boarded a city bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Her name was Rosa Parks. She was a Negro. When the bus driver ordered Ms. Parks to surrender her seat to a white man, she refused and was arrested. The popular legend of the tired seamstress reveals only part of the story. Rosa Parks was a seamstress, and she was tired. Just tired of giving in, she would write years later. She was also an active member of the NAACP. By the time Rosa Parks was arrested, community leaders had a plan in place to boycott Montgomery's segregated bus system. They were just waiting for the right person to be arrested. Someone who would anger the Negro community into action. Someone of unimpeachable character. Someone like Rosa Parks. Within days, the Montgomery Improvement Association was formed to guide the Montgomery bus boycott. It was the first large-scale and enduring protest for Negro rights. For leadership, the protesters chose a young Baptist minister, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Signs were posted around town. Don't ride the bus today. Don't ride it for freedom. The boycotters organized carpools. They rode in taxicabs. They walked. Through heat and cold, rain and snow, they refused to ride the bus. The city of Montgomery lost as many as 35,000 fares each day during the boycott. But even as weeks turned to months, they refused to meet with demands for more courteous service, equal seating privileges, and the hiring of Negro bus drivers. Instead, they held fast to their segregationist convictions and filed suit against movement leaders. Even under attack, King and the others would not be provoked to violence.
We still feel that we are right and that we stand within our constitutional rights in the protest. And we still advocate nonviolence, passive resistance, and still determined to use the weapon of love.
The idea of passive resistance was inspired by India's Mohandas Gandhi. Gandhi's campaign of nonviolent civil disobedience during the 1940s had confounded British imperialists and helped lift India from nearly a century of colonial rule. On the streets of Montgomery, passive resistance bore similar fruit. In November 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld a ruling that declared segregated busing to be unconstitutional. The protest ended a month later, 381 days after it began. The Montgomery bus boycott was a major victory against racial segregation and propelled the civil rights movement to national attention. Martin Luther King became its public face and voice, its most influential leader, and its most lucrative target. During the bus boycott, King's Montgomery home was bombed and shot at. He was harassed and arrested. For King and the cause, it was symbolic of the determined opposition and deadly violence that lay ahead. In the wake of the Montgomery victory, Martin Luther King brought together other black ministers and community leaders to form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. With King as its president, the SCLC championed voter registration drives and supported bus boycotts in other parts of the South. At about the same time, President Eisenhower's Attorney General, Herbert Brownell Jr., drafted a proposal for new civil rights legislation. It was universally opposed by Southern legislators. Nevertheless, Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson guided a diluted bill to final passage by a 60-15 vote, establishing the Civil Rights Act of 1957. The NAACP's Roy Wilkins dismissed it as a crumb from Congress. Even so, it was the first civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. The law provided new authority to the Justice Department to oversee elections and investigate officials who interfered with voter registration. It also created a new division within the Justice Department to prosecute civil rights violations. The legislation was a symbolic victory for King and other civil rights leaders, but not enough to silence their rising demand for full legal, economic, and social equality. In some cases, the most deafening statements were made without uttering a word. In 1960, in Greensboro, North Carolina, 4 freshman college students walked into a Woolworth's drugstore and sat down at a lunch counter reserved for whites. The Greensboro Four, as they became known, were refused service, but they remained seated in silent protest until the store closed. Their sit-in continued for weeks and ignited a wave of similar demonstrations. Within months, the movement reached every southern state and attracted more than 50,000 students.
They come in and they sit down, and we're not used to them sitting down beside us because I wasn't raised with them. I never have lived with them, and I'm not going to start now.
Demonstrators encountered humiliation, abuse, and police harassment. But they held fast to their principles of passive resistance. During a sit-in staged in Nashville, Tennessee, silent protesters were chided with insults and attacked. They refused to fight back, but 81 demonstrators were arrested anyway on charges of disorderly conduct. John Lewis, who would rise to prominence with the movement, later recalled this life-changing moment.
It was really happening, what I'd imagined for so long, drama of good and evil playing itself out on the stage of the living, breathing world. It felt holy and noble and good. That paddy wagon seemed like a chariot to me, a freedom vehicle carrying me across the threshold.
The arrests galvanized the Nashville student movement. Student leader Diane Nash led 3,000 protesters in the first major march of the civil rights movement. The aim? To challenge Mayor Ben West to take a stand on segregation.
And we needed him to say integrate the counters, or to tell Nashville to do what Nashville knows it should have done a long time ago, like about 95 years ago after the Civil War. So I asked the mayor, first of all, Mayor West, do you feel that it's wrong to discriminate against a person solely on the basis of his race or color?
Ultimately, the answer was yes. Within a month, Nashville became the first major city in the South to begin desegregating its public facilities. Building on the success of the sit-in movement, Nash and others formed a new organization to harness the energy of young people for the cause of civil rights, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. Younger and more aggressive than the senior civil rights organizations, SNCC members became the shock troops of the revolution, willing to take the fight to the racist enemy in the most intolerant parts of the South. As a Mississippi farmer named Hartman Turnbull would observe,
Power seek the weak places, water seek the low places, but SNCC done seek the hard places, seemed like to me.
the sit-in protests attracted the first widespread media coverage of the civil rights movement. Photographs and film footage from places like Nashville provided many Americans with their first glimpse of the racism and discrimination that had infected the South for generations. News reports in October 1960 that Martin Luther King had been jailed for participating in a sit-in were brought to the attention of a young senator campaigning to be president. John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts was not a supporter of civil rights, but he recognized that political capital could be gained by reaching out to Negroes. At the urging of his advisors, Kennedy intervened on behalf of the incarcerated civil rights leader and helped win his release.
Well, I owe a great debt of gratitude to Senator Kennedy and his family for this. I don't know the details of it, but naturally I'm very happy to know of Senator Kennedy's concern and all that he did to make this possible.
The maneuver paid off. With King's endorsement, candidate Kennedy carried 70% of the nation's black vote and won the presidency by the narrowest of margins. As the new president assumed office in January 1961, many blacks rightfully expected bold new civil rights initiatives. But Kennedy had other priorities. His New Frontier proposals required the support of Southern Democrats, and Cold War concerns in Cuba, Berlin, Vietnam, and elsewhere left little room on the presidential agenda for civil rights. But the demand for change could not be quieted. The Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, spearheaded the movement's boldest initiative to date, the Freedom Rides, a descent into the Deep South by bus to test compliance with Supreme Court rulings barring segregated interstate travel. CORE founder James Farmer acknowledged the perilousness of the journey.
I think all of us were prepared for as much violence as could be thrown at us. We were prepared for the possibility of death.
On May 4, 1961, two buses departed Washington, D.C., carrying black and white volunteers into forbidden territory. These were the first Freedom Riders. In Atlanta, they parted for the journey through Alabama. When the first bus reached Anniston, it was attacked and firebombed. The Freedom Riders barely escaped alive. The second bus met a similar fate in Birmingham. The city's notorious public safety commissioner, Eugene Bull Connor, made good on his promise to allow Klansmen 15 minutes to do their dirty work.
And with me are part of a group calling themselves the Freedom Riders, an interracial group traveling through the Deep South to challenge some of the segregated bus facilities in this part of the country. Yesterday they ran into trouble. They ran into violence. Today they say they intend to keep up their pilgrimage. Mr. Peck, you obviously have been injured. You're wearing bandages. What happened to you?
I got beaten twice yesterday by hoodlums, once aboard the bus and once in the terminal in Birmingham.
The attacks left the Freedom Riders wounded, terrified, and trapped among those who had tried to kill them. In Washington, the reaction of President Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, was mixed. They feared for the Freedom Riders' safety, but worried that offering federal protection to the group would inflame the white South. "Tell them to call it off," the president demanded of an aide. "Stop them. Get your friends off those buses." But it was too late to turn back. SNCC leader Diane Nash recognized this as a watershed moment.
If they stop us with violence, the movement is dead. We are coming.
Nash sent SNCC volunteers to replace the battle-weary core group in Birmingham. Learning of this, the president lost his composure. All hell is going to break loose. She's going to get those people killed. The situation fell to Bobby Kennedy. As head of the Justice Department, he was empowered to intervene if he suspected federal laws were being violated. He dispatched his assistant, John Siegenthaler, to Birmingham to rescue the Freedom Riders. On May 20th, Siegenthaler boarded a Birmingham to Montgomery Greyhound bus, along with the SNCC reinforcements. Their arrival in Montgomery was met by a mob of more than 1,000 screaming racists. Some Freedom Riders were able to flee, but others were overwhelmed by fists, iron pipes, axe handles, and baseball bats. John Lewis was beaten and bloodied. Siegenthaler himself was struck in the head with a pipe and kicked unconscious. With no other option, Attorney General Kennedy asserted federal authority by ordering 400 U.S. Marshals to Montgomery to restore order and escort the Freedom Riders to safety. Freedom Riders continued to probe the Deep South through the summer of 1961, inspiring arrests and violence, and forcing the Kennedys to confront the issue head-on. Bobby Kennedy began to see the civil rights debate in a new light, not as one issue among the thousands confronting the administration, but as the defining moral issue of the era. As a first step, he petitioned the Interstate Commerce Commission to adopt new regulations that would stiffen already existing federal laws, requiring all interstate transportation facilities to be integrated. But more importantly, the younger Kennedy's attitude influenced the president's evolving position on civil rights.
I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
In 1963, Southern segregationists got a new rallying cry, and the civil rights movement gained a new arch-villain. But even as Alabama's incoming governor, George Wallace, invoked the spirit of the Confederacy, movement leaders were preparing to challenge segregation and racial hatred in the state's largest city, Birmingham. Like many southern cities, Birmingham was struggling to throw off its racist legacy.
You've got to keep the white and the black separate, just like you got to keep them in school.
The town's top police official, Eugene Bull Connor, embodied the entrenched prejudice of the Old South. He had given Klansmen free rein to beat the Freedom Riders in 1961, just as he allowed them to persecute Birmingham's black population and firebomb their homes with impunity. By 1963, the public outrage sparked by the Freedom Rides and other high-profile civil rights demonstrations had disappeared. The movement needed to provoke the kind of newsworthy confrontation that would capture headlines and TV screens. If you're looking for a fight, Martin Luther King was told, you're sure to find a good one in Birmingham. King and the SCLC launched Project C on April 3, 1963. The C stood for the Confrontations, designed to bait Bull Connor into outrageous action. 9 days in, the campaign was in trouble. Martin Luther King had been arrested for violating a court order and was languishing in jail. It was here that he penned his famous Letter from a Birmingham Jail, concluding that one day the South will recognize its real heroes. King was released from jail on April 20th to find the Birmingham movement in peril. With few adults willing to risk jail time, the city's black youth rose up and marched into history. At 1 o'clock on May 2nd, D-Day, a group of students emerged from the 16th Street Baptist Church singing, "We Shall Overcome." Hundreds were arrested and loaded onto school buses destined for the city jail. The next day, Bull Connor called in the fire department and K-9 units. Teenagers and children became targets for high-pressure water hoses and snarling police dogs. News reports and images from Birmingham spread like wildfire. The New York Times called the events a national disgrace that made a mockery of the legal process. A letter to the Washington Post read, "If the United States doesn't stand for some decent average level of human dignity, what does it stand for?" Day after day for a week, the scene was replayed. Bull Connor filled the jail and then the county fairground with thousands of youthful prisoners. But still, more came. Birmingham business leaders finally agreed to negotiate. Within days, an accord was reached to desegregate the city. Events in Birmingham shone a hard light on America's race problem and influenced many citizens to re-examine their own views on the issue. Among them, President John F. Kennedy. 1 month after the Birmingham settlement, the president made an unprecedented statement on national television.